Thank you very much, President Cardozo and Sergio. I thank you, all of you, for taking the time to be here today, and I'm just very grateful for this chance to meet with all of you. I'm sure I'm going to learn more in this afternoon, perhaps than I have to contribute, but I will do my best to start off the conversation on a good note. I would like to, in the next 30 or 40 minutes, I would like to try and place in broad context the changes going on in policing generally around the globe, focusing not particularly on any particular strategy or crime problem, but really on the governance of the police function itself. We are living at a time in Brazil, in the United States, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, throughout Latin America, where what is being expected of police is changing very quickly, where the tools police have to work with are changing very quickly, and where this is creating both tremendous pressure and complexity for the police itself, but it is also creating dangers for our societies in terms of our understanding and governance of the police function itself. So let me try and sketch first some changes in policing and then some implications for the governance of police. I will try occasionally. I know I've been a visitor to Brazil on and off over the last 10 years. I try to follow the news from Brazil, particularly from Rio and São Paulo, and some colleagues in Minas who keep me up to date there. I will try to say a few things about the relationship of my themes to the situation in Brazil, but I really hope we can draw that out in discussion and debate because I'm hardly an expert on that. I like to start with this. There's a report issued. Brown is a member of Parliament in Canada, and there has been over the last few years a huge crisis of confidence in what many of us would have regarded as one of the well-regarded national police forces of the world. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, are a 138, 140-year-old police organization that has enjoyed, until the last few years, a very good reputation, both for operational effectiveness and for integrity. And in the last few years, they've had a series of scandals that cost the commissioner of the Mounted Police his job and has dragged the reputation of the Mounties down in Canada to the point where there have been a series of inquiries about corruption, about mismanagement of investigations, and even about financial fraud within the or misconduct within the organization itself. This inquiry this particular inquiry began into a pension, potentially pension fraud within the organization, but it broadened into a critique of the police organization itself. And this is just a small quotation from a long report talking about how, in this quotation, the prerogative, in English, the prerogative of the commissioner to direct the operation of the policing function is subject to virtually no oversight. That comment was meant not only as a comment about the Mounties, but really about policing globally. And then he asks, can we even imagine a modern governance structure? Think about a board, independent directors, the kind of thing that a public company would have to have. Can we imagine that kind of a governance structure for a police organization? Well, for a lot of police, this is unthinkable. And the arguments are often, and this report rehearses them, are often about, well, this has to be a sort of quasi-military, it's a command and control operation, there's lots of reasons why it has to be different. But in this inquiry, the commission decided, and Brown writes, I just don't actually accept, he says, any of those differences as meaning you can't govern the organization the way modern organizations are governed. And he goes through a series of other public authorities that do very specialized work that are, for instance, the National Bank in Canada, that are governed now in very modern, external, transparent ways. Why can't we have a modern governance for a police organization? and more importantly thinks we're going to have a modern governance system for police organizations, and lays that down. And I want to start with that because I think that may be a pretty good prediction of where we're going around the world over the next 20, 30 years. If we were to gather here in a couple of decades, we might be looking at governance structures around the world, maybe not in Brazil yet, but governance structures around the world for police that look very different than they do today. So let's do a very quick history of how we got here to this crisis. I'm going to try and do about 300 years of police history in two or three slides. So the fundamental point about the history of policing is that modern police organizations, which date roughly from the French monarchy in the 18th century and the British Parliament creation of both a domestic police force and then a special colonial police force for Ireland in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Those police organizations and all of their variants around the globe basically balance three things. You can see this most clearly probably in the French history. The French king first counted on the magistrates to keep order around the country. But the problem is he raised revenue by selling these offices. So you could become a magistrate by buying the office. And once you'd bought your office, you sort of thought, well, I bought it, I paid for it, I can sort of do what I want now. And the king started having a very hard time controlling what the magistrates were doing or getting information back. And the history of the national police in France largely dates from the monarchy's desire to have eyes and ears and hands on the ground when he couldn't count on the local magistrates and their bailiffs to go do his bidding. So this was a model of policing that was really all about the executive, service to the executive. And yet within about a minute of starting, the police quickly realized in order to get information, they had to start taking care of local problems of local people because that's how they were going to get the cooperation and the information that the king wanted. And when they found someone who was doing something bad, they had to take them somewhere, and the somewhere was the local courts. And so the task for the police in the history of policing in France and England and all over becomes the balancing of these three sources of power, of authority, and of legitimacy, and of information, and of resources. So the balancing of the courts or the law, the executive, and the people, the public, that balancing and shifting is essentially the history of police over the last 300 years. One way to think about the professionalization of police that occurs in different countries and different cities during the 20th century is that it's an effort to get some distance from their original creator, from the executive. The executive can begin to corrupt the police, using them to promote the party in certain elections or to attack political opponents. And in order to get some protection against political patronage and the corruption of control of too close from the executive, a notion of professional policing and professional independence from the executive grows up. And that professionalism tends to be very legalistic, particularly in the United States, but also in other countries. The vision of professional policing the police begin to identify with their legal mandate and service to the law. You can see that in a very simple way. In the U.S., as you may know, we combine our civil and military police into a single police organization. We say we do. In fact, if you walk into a police organization in the United States, the plainclothes detectives, who are essentially like the civil police, do their work, and they won't even report to the head of the station they're sitting in because he's a military uniformed guy. He's in charge of the patrol officers. So we say we combine them. In fact, in many police agencies, the detectives and the patrol officers, the uniform and plain clothes, move up through two totally different ranks. In New York City, where I am from and did most of my first early work, until you got to the commissioner himself, they reported up through completely different chains. So we say it's one organization. In some ways, it's two. But the point was to get the commissioner's job during this professional era, almost everybody got it by going up through the detective ranks. That was where the higher educated officers went. That's where the greater prestige in the organization was, because it's associated with the courts, with the law. That was where a professional police organization got its authority and legitimacy. But from the 1980s on, sort of late 20th century, with the rise of what we now call community policing, that shifted. And you began to see, and since about 1990, almost all the famous police chiefs in the United States come not from the detective ranks, but from the patrol ranks. You're seeing a real shift. And why is that? It's because community policing is a tilt away from the courts and away from law and just service to prosecution, and more towards service to the individual community, service to the citizens, and trying to reconnect that way. So we could go through other examples, but I think one way to understand this long history is of this balancing. You get very one of my pet topics, one of my favorite complaints these days is the way the U.S. and other countries are trying to create police agencies in post-conflict or pre-conflict or just conflict situations. So the huge and expensive effort of the U.S. government and other governments to create a new police force in Iraq or Afghanistan, and then to do it again, and then to do it again, and we keep getting reports that we have to scrap the whole thing and start all over again. One of the problems is the visions of police in those post-conflict situations is essentially an adjunct to the military. That effort to create a police has got this balance completely wrong. And one sign of getting this balance wrong is when the police become essentially a paramilitary operation. It's not just that their tactics are bad. Any police organization probably has somewhere within it a paramilitary type unit. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that tactic is not an appropriate tactic for police organizations. But the model of the organization as aligned with a military presence is almost certainly wrong. It's almost certainly what you don't want to do in a police organization. The military might need a civilian, a lower level, a paramilitary force. The police may need those tactics. But to create a police agency that is so aligned with the executive that it's operating on essentially a military model essentially deprives the citizens of a real police force. That's what you're doing there. You may need that function, but if that's the function being played by your only police, what you've really done is hijack the police away from its historic role. And I fear that's often what U.S. and other governments' assistance into these difficult situations can be like. So governance mechanisms have also adjusted. The point is, with this, as the police balance where they're getting their authority and legitimacy from the executive, the courts, and the people, so too the governance mechanisms are reflecting those differences. And so what do I mean by that? Here are three implications. Executive governance in recent times has tried to get control of the police through new kinds of secretariats. So in South Africa, when the government comes in, wants control of the police, worries the police is still loyal to a previous apartheid regime, needs the police desperately to do the work of a police. So it creates a new Secretariat of Safety and Security, trying to give the executive more power, more control over the police. Creates a new police commissioner role, police chief executive role. Other governance devices trying to strengthen executive control of the police. And in some cases, you see chief executives taking a bigger role. In India, you see this a lot. Chief ministers at state level playing a bigger and bigger role in the personal selection and interviewing of finalists for the top police jobs. So too, courts are trying to reach out and trying to secure their control, their governance of police through actual rulemaking. So not just deciding cases, but using cases to announce new rules about how the police have to behave in this kind of situation or that kind of situation. And you can see it as in my country, we distinguish prosecution and courts, but in most of the world, the prosecution function is seen as part of the judicial apparatus. And prosecution-led investigation, the role of prosecutors beginning to direct police inquiries, particularly in complicated cases, is a growing phenomenon around the world, both in civil and common law countries. And finally, citizen governance of the police has also been stretched. So think of the role of business associations. Now, all over the world, there are growing numbers of often nonprofit, private associations, often of businesses in a central business district or sometimes nationally, that pool their resources and begin to work with the police to try and improve effectiveness, but also make sure that they're getting the kind of policing to their issues they're concerned about. A consortium of Wall Street investment firms supports the police of New York City and also pays for a local police station in the Wall Street area that wouldn't otherwise be justified on deployment patterns. So again, I hope that this lens, thinking about the police governance and police structure on these sort of tripartite, three sort of triangle of police authority, is useful that way. Now, if you were in the police and you were faced with that, one thing you'd want to do, you'd realize you're being torn apart, right? You've got the executive telling you to do one thing, the court's telling you to do something else, the citizens telling you to, do what they want to do. How do you manage all of this? And there'd be this huge desire to sort of simplify, or at least, or even get rid of all of this authority and just do what you want to do. And that is exactly what happens in police organizations. So they do two things. They get better at managing this array of governance, and they strive for independence from these things. So we can follow those two themes as we go through here. So let me just give you another example before we shift off this of how individual citizens have been extending their governance of the police. I talked about treaty bodies and business associations, but perhaps the biggest change has been the rise of new complaints authorities. You have in Brazil now, several states have what we translate as ombudsman. Ouvidor is a police ombudsman that can receive complaints about police conduct. They can't, last time I checked, they couldn't conduct their own independent investigations, but they can monitor the investigation that's done by the police, review it, and raise questions or concerns about the investigation if it hasn't been proper. Those kinds of complaint mechanisms are proliferating all over the world. Civil and common law countries all over the world, you see more of these. And probably the most dramatic sign of their growing power is not only the statutory authority, but the actual authority of the Independent Police Complaints Commission in England, which I suspect many of you are familiar with because of the case of Jean-Charles de Menezes, who was killed, as you know, by the Metropolitan Police on the 22nd of July, 2005. Now, I'm sure there's lots of emotion and lots of concern about this case in Brazil, and as there is indeed all over the world. But the aspect of this case I want to remind you of is a very particular one that you may have missed, which is that on the evening of the 22nd, that's a picture of Jean-Charles de Menezes lying dead at the Stockwell tube station on the Underground. And that evening, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Ian Blair, who was at that point probably at the peak of his popularity. He had the investigation of the real bombings in London on the 7th of July had been probably one of the most brilliant police investigations ever mounted. And if you remember, no one was expecting, blew up, killed over 50 people, and bombed the transit system in London. And within 72 hours, we were all looking at photographs of the bombers. And the photographs weren't taken of them doing the bombing. What they had done is they had found images, and they'd traced them back. They could follow the people all the way through thousands and thousands of images until they found good images of their faces from completely different places. And those were the images that were then broadcast as a way to try and get information about them. So whereas a lot of American police forces would have done dragnets right around Stockwell and tried to probably stop everybody who looked vaguely of Arab descent, the Metropolitan Police did an extraordinary operation of intelligence policing and detective work, and so Sir Ian Blair was probably at the height of his popularity and effectiveness when his officers assassinated Jean-Charles de Menezes, and what he did then, he was faced with a statute that gave the Independent Police Complaints Commission unique authority to investigate every officer-involved shooting in England and Wales, to conduct the police investigation itself. The commissioners can't have any experience in policing, and they have exclusive jurisdiction to investigate all deaths in police custody or during arrest. So Sir Ian Blair calls up Nick Hardwick, the head of the commission, that night and says, "Would you please hold off for a little bit? This is very sensitive, big anti-terrorist operation. We'll take care of this. Just would you wait?" And then, without telling Hardwick, also calls the Home Secretary and says, "We have a morale. We don't want to damage the morale of this operation. They just It looks like there's a problem here. It looks like this guy wasn't the guy we thought he was. Would you please not do that? Now, the amazing thing about that is if we were teaching this at Harvard in a school of government, the right answer to this question is the Prime Minister is going to let Syrian Blair conduct that investigation. This is a terrorist operation. This is a real terrorist operation with real terrorists, real bombs, killing real people right in London. This is the day after a second attack turns out to have been conducted. And Syrian Blair looks like a police genius, and nobody's questioning his integrity. Everybody would have predicted that the Prime Minister would have said, right, why don't you take care of it? We're not going to let this new startup agency that's never done anything serious come in and do this most important thing. And what's amazing is that's not what happened. The Prime Minister said, no, the Independent Police Complaints Commission is going to investigate this case. Now, this case was probably the most important challenge to the integrity of the Metropolitan Police, probably in a century. And it got put in the hands of a body that was created because of individual citizen complaints against the police. So imagine if that had happened in a Brazilian state and the police ombudsman would have been given authority to conduct the investigation of the police case. You can't imagine it. Well, we couldn't imagine it in England either. And it happened. So again, a sign about how strong this shift in governance really is. These are some scenes that may be a little closer to home. These are all from Rio in the last little bit. The point here is that while I've been describing governance mechanisms that are really balanced across these three sectors, it is easy to see how